Welcome back to Exploring the Old Testament. I'm Dr. Hutchins. Today we want to have a special lecture about how to read the part of the Old Testament that is law, the Old Testament law. Now, it's admittedly very difficult to read the Old Testament law. It has these long, detailed descriptions about sacrifices and skin diseases and so many things that seem completely irrelevant to the Christian life. However, the law remains relevant to Christians, and I think if we look at a few hints about how to read the law, then we're going to be able to read it in a more beneficial way as Christians. So I have 7 hints for reading the Old Testament law. Number 1 is to read the law as part of the story. We just can't forget, these aren't just abstract laws, abstract principles. These occur within the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the wandering in the wilderness, the preparation to enter into the promised land. They're not moral principles, but they are specific demands that God made upon his people as their Savior from the land of Egypt. And so God is demanding this obedience, not as some sort of dictator, but as a loving Savior. The second hint is to receive the law as instruction. So we're calling it the law because that's the main way we translate the Hebrew word Torah. But Torah does not only mean law in that kind of negative sense as we see in the 10 Commandments, for example. Do not, do not, do not. No, instead, the word Torah can also mean instruction. It's not just a law that binds and restricts and keeps us from doing the things we really want to do. No, instead, it's the idea of instruction. It's the idea of God helping us to see what is good for us. His good intention in giving us a law that will protect us from what is hurtful, from what is bad for us, from what goes against his creation design. So instruction, when we think of instruction, it helps us. It trains us. It, in fact, gives us freedom as we take that instruction and we apply it to our lives. The third hint is to understand the law as an act of grace. This is very important because we look at the law and sometimes we put legalism on one side, grace on the other. And of course, that is true. Legalism is the opposite of grace, but legalism is not the same as the Old Testament law. The law is an act of grace if we read it within the story of the Old Testament itself. The Old Testament law was not given so that the people of Israel could earn a relationship with God. That's legalism, right? If you do the right things, you don't do any of the wrong things, then you can build or earn a relationship with God or your way to heaven or whatever. That's not what the Old Testament law is teaching us. The Old Testament law tells us that because we already have a relationship with God, this is how we are to live, or the nation of Israel was supposed to live. So the nation of Israel has a relationship with God because he saved them, he adopted them as his people, and therefore he is giving them the law as his gracious way of showing them how to live as his people. The law instructs God's people on how to live a holy life. Number 4, we should view the law as a boundary marker. So the nation of Israel is God's special rescued people, and a lot of the law is ways that God was going to protect their distinct identity in comparison with the nations that surrounded them. So we don't always have to understand why God gave us special instruction. For example, one of the laws is do not boil the meat from a baby goat in its mother's milk. That's Exodus 23:19. So why does God tell the nation of Israel not to boil a baby goat in its mother's milk? We don't know, but we do know that God's commands made Israel distinct. It distinguished Israel from other nations. So sometimes you'll hear someone say that God gave certain regulations because they were healthier. So for example, if you follow the kosher Jewish diet of not eating pork and not eating shellfish and those different things that are regulated in the Old Testament law, someone will say that was because that's a healthier diet than other diets. Well, that can't always be proven in every case. And so we can't know whether or not God did this because it's healthier or because of some other reason, but we can know that God gave regulations so that Israel would be distinct and different, set apart from the other nations around them. Number 5, look at the 2 types of commands in the Old Testament law. So not every command is the same. And when we try to interpret and understand the commands, it's very important to categorize them into these 2 different categories. 1 is direct commands, and 2 is case-by-case commands. So direct commands give a straightforward command of what a person should or should not do. And the 10 Commandments are a good example of this. They are absolute direct commands. Do not commit adultery. Do not kill. Those are direct to us. And they tend to be more universal in application. But there are also in the Old Testament law what we call case-by-case commands. These are commands that are conditional, and most of them take the form of, if this happens, then that. So Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 to 8 is a good example. If there is a poor person among you, one of your brothers within any of your city gates in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your poor brother. Instead, you are to open your hand to him and freely loan him enough for whatever need he has. So there is a command. If you see someone like this, then this is what you're supposed to do. And this may seem like a minor distinction, but the point is that even in ancient Israel, the various commands had different levels of relevance to their lives, okay? So not every command was equally relevant to all people at all times. There were laws that were case by case, situation by situation. And then there were other laws that were much more universally applicable to everyone all the time. The 6th hint is to see the covenant structure of the Old Testament law. So the law is more than just a law code. It comes in the form of a covenant. And in the ancient Near East, a covenant was a common way for there to be an agreement, especially between a king that was more powerful and was conquering other kings, and those kings that were surrendering and becoming kings that were serving that powerful king. So you had a conquering king and you had a conquered king, and the conquering king would make a covenant with the conquered king, and this would be an agreement that this king is going to do certain things to benefit the one he has conquered, while the conquered king has certain obligations to the king who has conquered him. So that was a normal way to set up agreements in this time period. And the covenant that God makes with the nation of Israel follows the same pattern we see in other treaties that are in the ancient Near East. And so this pattern includes an identification of the parties. So you would say who is involved. And we see, for example, in Exodus chapter 20, God saying, I am the Lord your God. And then there's a review of the history. So the second section is how this relationship between these kings came about. And in the nation of Israel, that is, I am the Lord your God, what? Who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So this is where our relationship stems from. I brought you out of the land. And then they would give the obligations. And in this instance, that is the law itself, especially the 10 Commandments. And then there would be an identification of the witnesses to this agreement. So in an agreement between kings, maybe you would have different people or different gods that were called upon. And in the Mosaic covenant, sometimes it is the creation itself is called as a witness. The words of the book itself is called as a witness. The people themselves are called as a witness. And even in Joshua 24:27, there is a stone that is erected as the witness to the covenant. And then the covenant comes to an end with consequences for unfaithfulness to the covenant, which we see in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where there is a blessing for obedience, there is a curse for disobedience. The seventh hint is to know that as a Christian, you are free from the law. So Christians, sometimes we ask these questions. Should Christians today or the government today stone people for blaspheming the name of God? Or are Christians required to rest on Saturday, the Sabbath day? Should Christians avoid pork and observe the Old Testament feast? All of those are questions that we still debate in society, in the church, even in politics. And so it's important to understand the relationship of the Christian to the law of Moses. And it's been a controversial topic from the very beginning of the Christian church. We read about that controversy in Acts chapter 15, where there was a portion of the church that wanted to circumcise the Gentiles, these non-Jewish people who were becoming Christians, and make them obey the Old Testament law. The book of Galatians is entirely about this problem. Should the Gentiles become Jews, become circumcised in order to be Christians? And as Christians, we have dealt with this problem in different ways throughout the centuries. But I think if we look especially at the Apostle Paul, then we're going to see a way that he's going to show us that we can understand our relationship to the law as New Testament believers, as Christians. So the first thing that Paul does is he rejects the law as a covenant. The Christian is no longer under the dominion of the law as a covenant. So the covenant that we read about in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Numbers, Exodus, that covenant was for ancient Israel. It determined the relationship of that nation to their God. And as Christians, we are free from that law. That covenant is no longer in effect. Paul says in Galatians 5:18, "But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." That law that we used to be under, that all the world used to be under, it determined our relationship with God because we failed to obey that law. We are sinners. But Jesus paid the penalty of that sin, and now we are free from the law. We are no longer under the law because we have a new covenant through Jesus Christ. We are no longer under the law of the old covenant. The second thing that Paul does is he replaces the law. Our relationship with Jesus Christ has replaced our relationship to the law. Christ has become for us a new law. Paul describes this in various ways in his letters. He says that now we are no longer under the law of Moses, but in Romans 3:27, he says we are under the law of faith. In Romans 8:2, he says we are under the law of the Spirit of life. In 1 Corinthians 9:21 and Galatians 6:2, he says we are under the law of Christ. Or reading this in Galatians 6:15, "For both circumcision and uncircumcision mean nothing. What matters indeed is a new creation." What Paul is saying is that because we have been born again, because we have been made new, and in the new covenant, God has actually put good desires in our heart. He's written his law within our hearts. The old law is no longer binding upon believers. The important thing is that we have become a new creation and that the Spirit of God is within us, and he's actually giving us the desire to do what? To love God, which is actually going to fulfill the law. So what use is the law? Should we just cut these books, these portions out of our Bible? No, the law is still relevant to Christians, but it's relevant in a specific way. Paul uses the law in his letters as prophecy and as wisdom. So Paul recognizes that the law of the Old Testament, it prophesied certain things about who Jesus would be and what we would experience in the last days. And so it's still beneficial for us to read to see how it foretold of Christ, and it foretold of the need for us to be transformed and become the church. But secondly, it's also important for us as wisdom. The law continues to give us principles for the Christian life. What's interesting is that in the book of Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15, Paul says the law has been abolished for the Christian. But in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, he tells children to obey their parents because of the Ten Commandments. Honor your father and your mother. So which is it? Has the law been abolished, or does it still speak to us? He says one thing in Ephesians 2. He says what seems like a different thing in Ephesians chapter 6. And this is what Paul is doing. While we are free from the law as a covenant, we're no longer under the demands of the law and facing the punishment because Christ has freed us by dying in our place. At the same time, the law gives us wisdom to us. It testifies to many of the unchanging principles that God put into creation. So in that instance, God intends for children to grow up to maturity under the guidance of parents who love them. And so, yes, honor your father and mother. That's something you still should do, even though you're no longer under the covenant of the law. It remains just as true today as it did at Sinai.